Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a special 1-hour Protiviti webinar embedding GRC and internal audit into your business. Just wanted to provide some webinar information before we get on to the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded. All attendees will be emailed the link to rewatch the presentation. For questions during today's presentation, please insert them in the question window in the GoToMeeting toolbar or live tweet us your questions using the hashtag GRCwebinar. We will try to get to as many questions today after the presentation. We will be polling the audience today for insights and feedback. If you would like to receive CPE credit from today's webinar, please make sure to answer all 5 polling questions. If you would like to provide further feedback to our presenters today, you can fill out the form attached to the GoToMeeting toolbar. This is not required for CPE credit. Today's presenters are Scott Wisniewski, Managing Director here at Protiviti of our Risk Technology Services Group, James Ensminger, Director of our SharePoint and ECM Solutions Group here at Protiviti, and a special presenter today is Carrie Grigg, Director of Global Internal Audit at Crawford & Company, who will be providing his perspective from a client. Scott, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just a brief blurb about Protiviti in case you haven't heard of us. We are a global consultancy providing solutions to business problems in technology, business process, analytics, and general risk compliance transactions and internal audit. We work with a lot of the Fortune 1000 as well as the global Fortune 500. So again, you can see a little bit about us there. I think, one of the main message points is we'd be delighted to talk to you wherever you live and wherever you may be tuning in from around the globe. Oh, sorry, Julia. So for today's discussion, what we want to really discuss is, how to embed governance, risk, and compliance into line 1 and the opportunity that perhaps digitization offers us. Before we get started, we have some polling questions to ask.
Okay, and the first polling question is, does your company have a digital transformation effort underway? All right, and here's the results.
And Julie, if you don't mind reading off the results, I'm unable to see them on my end.
Okay, so 52% said yes, 23% no, and 25% unknown.
Okay, and so thanks for reading that off. Well, I think that's an interesting bit of feedback. I think it's pretty consistent with what we're hearing in the marketplace in terms of digitization efforts, and even the 50% that are underway. There's probably vagueness or ambiguity around what even digitization means. So today we want to start off our conversation with just a little bit of what we're seeing as a firm in terms of themes around digitization. But I think we want to drill into it. There's, related to that ambiguity we mentioned, digitization can mean so many things. And so today we're going to be drilling into the opportunity that digitization may provide from a governance, risk, and compliance perspective. There's so many different angles you can take on digitization that we want to be clear that we're drilling into that, and also give you a little bit of what we're seeing in the overall marketplace. So, here you're seeing just kind of a brief preamble around a brief history of digitalization, and we don't need to go into all of it. Obviously, it started with some of the PC revolution in the early 1970s and the internet in the 1990s, mobile computing in the 2000s. Well, now, when we look at it, there's so many different disruptive technologies that are making use of the preambles to this age of digitization in terms of blockchain, smart devices, digital currencies, a lot of peer-to-peer business, a lot of disintermediation of people in the middle of these processes, right? And so that is actually creating a lot of risk and a lot of opportunity at the same time. And on that note, in terms of the risk that digitalization is bringing, so we've taken a poll. So we do an annual survey with ISACA, and we took a poll of some of the different risks that the digital effort is bringing. And so certainly before we consider some of the opportunities that it's bringing, it's important to reflect on some of those risks, right? It's probably no surprise to those on this call that IT security and privacy, cybersecurity ranks among the top with obviously mobile platforms, cloud providers, the Internet of Things, all of those combining to equal a lot of information that is available on the web and in the public domain. Infrastructure management, I think, becomes another one of those major risks, and some of that revolves around both 2 and 4 with respect to, do you have the right people and skill sets to manage the right infrastructure? Do you have the right information security environment overall so that you have confidence where your data lives, how it's being classified? What are the control procedures and the frameworks that you're employing over that infrastructure that allow you to know that you have the right settings set up in place? So again, some of that comes down to a lot of really skill sets around infrastructure management and managing that internet. Emerging technologies and infrastructure changes, again, some of these go hand in hand with one another, right? As we transition to the cloud, that obviously brings new infrastructures. It means that we have to have different skill sets, and what previous skill sets we had maybe as assurance professionals start to morph into actually starting to create assurance over third-party providers in terms of how we use those innovative technologies that, again, make use of a lot of different third-party innovations. As all of this occurs, regulatory compliance becomes a real big challenge. The regulatory compliance is a challenge both from having the right infrastructure in place, the right information risk management program in place, as well as really being able to demonstrate it. And there is a bit of a differentiation between the two, because you might have a very good control of your overall security program, and yet its demonstrability, its defensibility might not be what you need from a regulatory, or I would actually say from a client, supplier, stakeholder perspective, where you might need to be communicating to the marketplace how you go about your information security risk, and yet you don't have all of the assets aligned to do so in an efficient way. You're burning cycles and responding to questionnaires, third-party requests, etc. I think on the right-hand side, 6 through 10, it comes to more, as things are proliferating, are you able to manage those projects? Are you able to control costs? Are you able to manage the budgets that you have related to it? And again, as this data proliferates, outside of that, are you actually able to manage your third-party vendor management relationships? So as we started to onboard ourselves into some of the opportunities that digital transformation brings, we wanted to start off a little bit around, what are some of the risks that it brings, right? And it brings us to this concept of the current state of the risk organization, right? And, a lot of this can be summed up in the picture that you see here, right? Where people are operating in their different environments. They're making best efforts. There's no one that, is not trying to do what's in the best interest of the organization, but there's a lack of visibility. Systems are not integrated. When you try to talk to business line professionals or line one professionals that might be responsible for risks, they're not even sure what they're supposed to be doing. And then when you do finally get their input, unfortunately for them, they have to go into multiple systems to even try to provide that input, right? So there's a high degree of fragmentation. there's different systems being utilized, and all of this creates kind of a fractured environment in terms of, how we're progressing through the digitalization effort and through managing risk. So we want to pause, I think, on this slide, and I guess, again, share a little bit of what we're seeing, in our organization, and provide some thoughts as we drill into the broad landscape of risk that digitalization brings. What about opportunity, right? And what we're seeing as Protiviti is that there's a few different themes that organizations that are looking to digitize are moving through. So the first key is digitalization brings the opportunity for better stakeholder engagement. There's many collaboration tools that are available, different ways of sharing information, different ways of bringing information out into the public domain, different social media methods of communicating on an ongoing basis. So the one thing that we're starting to see with organizations is that engaging stakeholders in a way that you couldn't have engaged them before is becoming really important. Operational performance is also becoming something that digitalization should start to address. And some of the examples, we see in here are where we find organizations many times have multiple systems that need to execute a single process. And that might be okay, right? A single system might actually, or multiple systems might have specific capabilities that are needed to address a specific process. However, a lot of times it's really not necessary. A lot of times it's a manifestation of legacy systems that have been cobbled together, and now you're faced with a place where the people in your business are having to go to multiple places to fulfill something. I see this a lot of times, for example, in the sales to contracting process where, maybe the sales took place in your CRM system, maybe the contract has to get fulfilled in your contract management system, and somewhere in between there is a sales leader or a member of the sales organization that's trying to kick off a project, and they're trying to work amongst these systems to actually execute a contract, right, and get it started. But they find that to be, a very inefficient, ungoverned process because it takes place over multiple systems. So again, we see this all the time, and that's just an example of, one of the areas that we see it in. But really having your people start to go to single spots where they can execute business processes becomes fundamental to improving operational performance. Business analytics and decision science, obviously, with the availability of data, becomes something important, and it becomes something that starts to become at the disposal of the risk professional. But what we want to talk a little bit about today in terms of that is making data not just available to the risk professional, but also that data that's historically been maybe very risk and compliance focused, starting to add value to business line professionals as well. So what kind of tools and techniques can we use to make some of that operational or compliance data also valuable from a business perspective? The last one you see here on the list is digitization of products and services. This one actually I think less applies to the GRC effort, so we're not going to touch upon this one too much, but I do think as a knowledge sharing perspective for today, we are definitely seeing people start to digitize their products and services. It actually starts with improving their legacy core infrastructure, right, so that they do follow more service-oriented architectures and they can face their business applications toward different stakeholder groups really quickly. One that comes to mind is, we helped an organization, one of our clients wanted to move towards a bank-in-the-box type of concept where, instead of the traditional brick-and-mortar banking, they offer their clients an opportunity to, bank through one single platform. Well, to do that, that has to interface with a lot of different capabilities, and so you need to modernize your architecture really to manifest that and to be able to serve the market in a different way that you've previously served them. So all of this brings us to the question, right, is from a GRC perspective, how can some of these digitalization themes help us really embed governance, risk, and compliance into the business. And we have some questions here, right? What if your corporate hub could help you promote your organizational culture, increase people's effectiveness and efficiency, share information both internally and with stakeholders, all while managing their underlying risks, documenting their controls, but not just documenting those controls, actually automating your business processes. Our takeaway from that is that when we look at traditional governance, risk, and compliance, most organizations we see are often focused really on the structured risk and compliance component of governance. Really what that means is identifying standards or regulations they have to comply with, documenting risks and controls, conducting assessments, conducting testing and validation routines, documenting policies around it, right? It's so much about the structured risk and control management pieces. And I think what's been left off the table is that the way organizations actually truly govern their business is in the way that they promote their organizational culture, the way that they actually let their stakeholders, their employees know what they're trying to execute upon from a strategic perspective, the way that they allow people to go to corporate knowledge centers and share information, use information in sales pitches, use single sources of information for their compliance exercises, embed governance processes into those hubs instead of only documenting that you should be doing things. And so when we look at this, there's an opportunity to mash up the unstructured ways that you promote your culture and that you share information with the underlying structured taxonomies that are historically involved in risk and compliance efforts. And we're going to demonstrate some of that today and also share some stories around that. So with that said, we're going to move into poll question number 2. So Julia, if you don't mind leading that process, that would be great.
All right, poll question number 2. Which of the following best describes the level of integration across your GRC processes and technology?
And Julia, please let me know when the results are up.
All right, and the results are 10% well coordinated, 54% somewhat coordinated, 36% GRC functions are mostly running independently.
Okay. Well, I think that's very interesting feedback, and I think I'm going to introduce James to take over this next section, but I would just lead with the concept that I think that's very consistent with what we're seeing across the board for our clients, where they are maybe somewhat integrated and only maybe in certain domains, but it leaves a lot of opportunity for us to lift that process up and really start engaging people in a different way.
Great, thanks, Scott. So as Scott mentioned, we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into the GRC domain now and look a little bit more at some of the analytics of what our clients are saying, some of the market feedback, and some of the analysts as well. But echoing the points just raised about that last polling question, it is very consistent. I think it's not without effort, but a lot of these operations and functions, especially in the assurance area, are working in silos. And so we'll talk a bit today about how we've seen that gap be bridged with our clients and across other examples. Before I do so, I'd like to just talk briefly about some of the different stakeholders. So certainly many of the individuals on this call, probably about 75%, are from the assurance domain. So risk management, audit, corporate compliance, policy, regulatory compliance, that kind of domain you'll see at the top there. We also have quite a few people on this call from the information technology area, so developers, IT managers, IT security, perhaps some third parties that we're working with as well around the security and IT infrastructure. But then we get into that line 1, and that's really what I think a lot of the focus or interest for this particular session today is, how do we engage line 1 in a meaningful way that helps provide inputs to all of these different assurance functions. And so with that, we're talking about, the process owners, perhaps more at a detailed level, business or action owners, right? Department leads, the individuals that are out in the field doing their work on a daily basis that provide feedback and information to the assurance and perhaps even the IT groups to help perform their activities, and again, in an integrated way. So as we go to the next slide, one of the interesting points here, this is from a Forrester review performed last year, but I think it kind of echoes what we're seeing with our clients as well. There's a lot of different use cases that people use GRC systems for, and in fact, as a lot of the analysts have pointed out, many organizations have multiple GRC systems, right? So they might be using multiple different tools for different assurance functions across the organization without the connectivity of each of those individually. In fact, I think it's an average that every organization has at least two GRC platforms. But what we find is a lot of times they're disappointed with the ability to leverage information across those systems, or they're disappointed with the ability to even use it across different domains. So that's why you find that organizations will have multiple platforms. When we look at the specific use cases, the leading one here for a GRC solution often is risk assessment. If we're looking at the audit domain, it's often just electronic work paper repository, or perhaps that remediation with the business involved to document issues and findings and again, resolution. But more broadly, some of the other themes that we're seeing here, GRC dashboarding reporting, certainly that's a key area of focus for GRC systems. But as you'll notice, we've highlighted a couple of these where we see a great degree of level 1 involvement. And I'll talk about those more specifically here. For risk assessment, oftentimes organizations will leverage their systems for GRC purposes to send out surveys to end users in a light way to get their feedback about the risk profile for the organization. It may be specific to the business unit or department, and it may be more general at an entity-wide survey. And we'll take some examples a little bit later today and talk about how clients have deployed that. Control monitoring and enforcement. This is an area where you might have your listing of controls out there. Perhaps they're a standardized control structure framework, PCI, ISO, COBIT, or even the COSO 2013 framework again, to look at what controls are in place in the organization and getting feedback from the business if they're performing those controls, perhaps getting a layer deeper and asking the business to provide evidence of those controls through information requests, either on a scheduled frequency or on an ad hoc basis during the course of an audit. Policy documentation management. This is an area where most often it's simply put that you're asking the business to provide feedback on policies, that they have read and understood the policies, that they certify that they're following their policies as laid out for them in their business unit or in their function. But oftentimes it often engages the business to provide updates to those policies. If they're making any changes, that goes through a workflow and approval process perhaps. Vendor third-party risk, that's another key area where we see a lot of business level 1 users involved. Perhaps as a business sponsor, they might want to send out a request to work with a new third-party individual. You can have a business sponsor promote that they want to work with this third-party organization, identify specific resources involved, and the systems, the GRC tools out there can provide an automated fashion, a structured way to follow that vendor through the onboarding cycle, including a risk assessment, contracting, all the way through the execution of their actual engagement and tracking their work involved. And then finally, the compliance and ethics training kind of dips into that policy piece I mentioned before, but a great way we've seen clients leverage the level 1 involvement here is by getting business users involved in just simply training or certifying that they follow those ethics programs as laid out in their policy for the organization. So a lot of different use cases here, but we wanted to summarize again how we see a lot of the level 1 business users getting involved in these activities across GRC solutions. As we go to the next slide, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into audit here. The most common that we see, most common use cases that we see clients using audit tools, whether it's an off-the-shelf platform or something simple as a file repository in the organization, would be through the risk assessments and also electronic work papers. But when you get business users involved, again, speaking of the level 1 involvement, it's most often at the risk assessment level for the same approach that I mentioned on the previous slide, but then monitoring and tracking and remediation, getting updates from the business as you're going through the action plan process and closing out those gaps that were identified in the audit itself. Another interesting point about this slide, this is an IA study performed a little over a year ago, But an interesting point about this slide is people are using these tools for all sorts of reasons, right? You won't often find an audit organization or an audit department that has the need to have a GRC system that supports every single one of these at a very detailed level. A lot of clients just focus on 2, 3, maybe 4 use cases, and so for that purpose it's important to find solutions that support those needs individually rather than maybe being a very broad system in general. So as we go to the last slide here before another polling question, we wanted to talk a bit about some of the elements of the infrastructure, right? And hopefully this is coming together for those that this is new to, but in general there are various inputs that we're talking about today, right? Those inputs might be line 1 inputs from the business. Those inputs might be external solutions, and we'll cover those in a moment. Those inputs go through some type of centralization or digital hub, a workplace to provide meaningful reporting in the end, right? And so we'll talk about some of those level 1 or line 1 inputs. They could be assessments, certifications, information requests, action plans, again, building on the previous few slides that we spoke about on how you get feedback from your process and business owners. Those external solutions might be a variety of GRC systems. So you might have off-the-shelf tools, you might be using SharePoint for some of this as well, but the idea is you have a variety of different external solutions that gather this information supporting the individual requirements of those assurance teams, perhaps even external databases. That could include ERP systems, payroll systems. It could include broader client tracking systems as well, IT security platforms. Maybe you're even looking at some of the firewall activity that's going on in the organization, and then even third-party content. This could include regulatory subscriptions that you have around changes to regulatory information or standards across the organization that they must comply with, and other third-party type content that you're looking to track. The idea is there's a lot of different information, right? And you think of that slide that Scott had up a moment ago with people running all over the place. This is even information coming from external parties. And with using something what we call more that digital hub, more simply put, it's basically gathering that information up, putting it into a relational data model that's meaningful and supported by an organization to manage the reporting that they'll get to in a moment. Using some basic workflow techniques, you can build out some sequences to manage the review and approval of information. If something happens across any one of those different platforms, centralizing the alerts to individuals, right? Or the escalation to notify maybe management that something has occurred across a number of different tools and there's a trend going on, and that KPI might provide an alert to management. And then some of the continuous control monitoring as well. So if we have a single control that's documented and tracked in an ERP system, but that control is also tested in a separate GRC system, and you don't have an integration there, you could use this central hub to kind of track, to support the tracking of that information. All of this drives to that awareness and analytics at the end. So your reporting experience, we'll share some examples today around some meaningful reports that are both mobile-based, as well as some search and query analytics that you can run into details and data mine some of that information. And then certainly, because you have all of this through an automated central system, you can also kick off workflows to third-party applications, send out alerts, and again, further the escalation and review process. So just take a moment there, and we'll go on to the poll question number 3.
Okay, poll question number 3. Do your line 1 professionals find it efficient to provide their inputs, for example, assessments and action plan updates, into your GRC systems and or processes?
Great, and I think, again, these polls are consistent with what we're seeing. Just for those that may not be able to see it, we see yes 22%, somewhat 52%, and no 27%. I think the challenge that a lot of organizations have is when they do engage line 1 users, especially when you have different assurance functions, risk management, internal audits, compliance, they're doing so in often different ways and redundant ways, right? And so we'll talk today and share some examples about how you can centralize that for those users, even if the assurance functions are using disparate applications. We have another polling question here to get some more feedback from the group.
All right, poll question number 4. Do your Line 1 professionals get the information that is relevant to them from your GRC systems and/or processes?
And again, I think consistent with the reason we joined the call today is to just share experiences on how others are getting benefit out of using a central system for this. But for those that can't see the polling, we have yes 16%, somewhat 58%, and no 26%. So it looks like a good majority are looking to increase or improve their way of sharing information with Line 1 users across their enterprise and collaborating with those stakeholders, and hopefully that's what you'll see here today. For those that do see that their users are getting a strong alignment and real good relevant information for them across those systems, we welcome any kind of Q&A type feedback that you might have, and we can share that with the group either on this call or in a debriefing afterwards with some of your experiences. With that, what I'll do is turn it over to Scott again. We'll go through an actual demonstration here of some of the Digital Hub experiences that we've had and building out a platform that can address some of these concerns we've been talking through. And I think Scott might be muted there.
Oh, yep. Thanks, James. So can you confirm that you're able to see the site before we move forward?
Yep, we can.
Okay, great. So it always helps to put a little bit of teeth and a little bit of illustration to a concept, right? So today's demonstration makes use of a couple of different technologies and examples. We're going to use SharePoint as the concept of the Digital Hub, and it's obviously a place that many organizations use as their corporate intranet. So it's a good place to start as this example of a hub, but again, that doesn't mean that that has to be your hub. It's just, I think, a really good ubiquitous system that's out there that people go to share and communicate knowledge. The other solution we're going to use as an example, as James alluded to earlier, is our own governance portal. And again, the point of this is not to actually say that these are the systems that need to be in use straight away, but it is to give an illustration of the types of information that you would store in different applications. And as James alluded to, a lot of times things need to bubble up from a subsystem. Well, you can see even from this stark demonstration that the first site I was showing in terms of the corporate hub, right, it's a lot more illustrative. It's a lot more communicative. It shares a lot of the information that starts to be what governance of an organization is about, that are actually somewhat unstructured and beyond the concepts of just risk and control taxonomies, right? You share knowledge, you share your appreciation for your employees in this area, right? You share corporate news with your organization, what's happening in the company, corporate events that might be relevant to different people that are going on. What are some of the latest news that you want to know? You provide resources, right? How do people in our company book travel, see their benefits, understand what their overall corporate strategy is? And again, on that note, that's something that, as I just kind of click over to here, this is just a loose example, but again, you're not going to typically see this in your GRC system, right? What's our mission, our vision, our values? What are the pillars of that mission and vision? How do we deliver offerings? How do we treat our customers? How do we empower our people? What's it to be like to work with third parties? And, are we socially corporate responsible? So again, the point being that the GRC application has a stark difference. It's very much nuts and bolts, most often used in companies. It's not the place where people go to for information. We'll drill into a few other concepts, but what I want to share first is that the concept, that we're seeing start to take shape is that there might be these multiple subsystems, but what if organizations had the ability to then surface that in a centralized hub, in a centralized area that mixes this unstructured data with some of the structured data under the hood, right? What if these action plans, and as you saw from that first slide and from various surveys that we showed, right? A lot of you are familiar with the ways you reach into line one, right? Action plan management is a key, right? Risk assessment. I don't think we were probably teaching anyone about that, but as other polling questions showed, for the most part, the GRC systems are only somewhat or not integrated, really. They operate independently. And what that means to business owners is that they're having to go to multiple places to do those risk assessments, sometimes redundantly. They're having to go to multiple places to manage action plans. And even amongst assurance professionals, then, it's unclear, what are the corporate action plans. So again, what if you had a place where that unstructured data and the sharing of information could meet up with the structured information that's bubbling up from your organization? Wouldn't that, really start to promote better governance in your business? So just as an example of what the assurance professionals do, and actually the sharing device here is a little bit challenging in terms of maneuvering. So what if, the GRC system or your governance, risk, and compliance program, forget about what system again that you use, but that governance, risk, and compliance program, what it's really bent on doing, right, is it's developing the structure of your organization in a very taxonomy-oriented way, right? What are the geographies? What are the lines of business that we do business in, right? Structuring that content. What are our policies and procedures? What do they look like? If I'm, in the financial services area, what are policies and procedures that might be relevant to me? How do those policies and procedures actually start to manifest themselves in other control frameworks, right? So how do we then do that taxonomy level type of information where maybe I'm managing IT security based on NIST control standards, right? And I have to develop these very deep oriented taxonomies. And again, my policies up at the top actually start to integrate with those corporate taxonomies. So again, just showing examples, and the key to the example is that, the governance, risk, and compliance system is the system under the hood and at that line too, where you're doing the deep work to really reflect what the organization looks like, reflect what your policies look like, reflect what areas of compliance you need to manage against, and developing risk and control information against them. Very similarly, what the risk management professionals also do is they start to, create different types of risk and control information, right? So from an audit perspective, perhaps you're conducting audits, and as you conduct those audits, you're creating findings that people have to manage towards, right? And so here we can see that audits developed a list of findings, and within those findings, audits documenting a lot of things. And again, they're doing the deep work. They're associating this finding with an element of the control structure. But that's not the area that your line one professionals are going to roll up their sleeves and get into and get mixed up in, right? What your line one professionals really need is this information to be surfaced and promoted to more of an enterprise layer where they can get in and out, very quickly, and for example, see what is due for them in terms of findings that have been raised. And maybe it's a lack of training that they have to document their compliance with. So again, more of a simplified view from a hub perspective where they can get in and out of their different areas of compliance. Perhaps, they need to provide some documentation. Maybe, as Jane, we'll get into in a little bit, they need to provide an information request that you're looking for. So it's an entirely different task. Notice that these are actually two different forms that are coming up, right? And that's okay, because what we're trying to do is centralize the asks of people. What do we need your input on? Come here and we'll simplify how you're going to give us your feedback. And maybe as they read up about their business, right, and we go to financial services, again, it's a commingling, it's a mashup of, the illustrative information you share about what our business is about. Here's, what our asset management business is about, our banking business, our broker-dealer business. But here, actually, is the policies that you need to comply with. And as you would have noted, right, from before, these are actually residents in the underlying GRC system bubbling up to the surface so that people know what they need to know, and it's surfaced in one centralized place for that particular community, avoiding redundancy and yet targeting certain stakeholder groups. And again, giving them a quick snippet, or of course, things that document management, enterprise content management, certainly SharePoint is great at, is, providing the files and the documentation around it so they can go read up more about what they want to know about. One of the keys that we talked about in the onset, though, is that it's more than just documenting policies and procedures. It's about enforcing control. It's about automating business processes. So as you feed your lines of business, what if you went into your operations and the partner and supplier management? Maybe I am a sponsor of a supplier, and rather than document the control, I actually automate that process. So when I go to my supplier management, before I can ever onboard somebody, it asks me to respond to a set of questions. And again, we won't go into those questions that you need to respond to, but right away it kicks off and triggers a workflow that enforces the policy, that enforces the process, again, all in one place, not that you have to go to a lot of different locations to execute that process. And finally, what if the risk and compliance team actually had their own area where they could go and they could manage risks and controls and execute some of those requests or log those findings that document and flow up into different areas of the business. Again, having their own workspace, but surfacing that in different places. This is the concept of the digital hub in terms of really putting a central location of different types of GRC activities, but surfacing them to the right audience, to the right stakeholder group. And one last example that's actually designed more for a mobile experience. So, you'll see kind of a login here, but again, this is really for a mobile type of experience. But what if the information from the digitization effort started to be something that you could promote that gives more tangible information than just kind of, again, the total compliance-oriented information. So again, we're working with customers to develop risk indices that actually use data from some of those subsystems that James was talking about to create an index of where you stand. And imagine if you could pull this up on your mobile device and see that, based on a methodology that's been implemented across the business, I'm at a risk level of yellow, and I can see at the drop of a hat what's starting to contribute to that risk level. I could drill into that area on my mobile device and, understand, once again, some of not only the different components, as we alluded to, but also see what those factors are and perhaps drill in even further so that I could understand, from a compliance perspective, what are the specific metrics that are bubbling up in my organization that are leading to this risk position that I have in my business line or my corporation overall. And again, here you're seeing examples, right, of findings and issues and indicators that are creating some of these risk indices and from a a compliance perspective, right? The number of cited violations, the coverage plan, etc. So we wanted to give you a brief demo of a digital hub, really more to give some teeth to the concept that we're sharing with you today, but then, move back into what are some practical client applications of this. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it back to James and Carrie to share some client stories. And I think one of the themes of those is that while we promote this large vision, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. You might tackle different elements of this at different times.
That's exactly right, Scott. And from a real tactical standpoint, and how do clients approach this, as you mentioned, there's a lot that we went through. There were 2 different GRC platforms, some being in SharePoint, some being in an off-the-shelf tool, pulling together into a centralized hub, right? I think what's important to know here is that you don't have to tackle all of this at once. We like to find areas where clients can just get some immediate value. And this is a good example of a global apparel manufacturer that we worked with that came to us with the need to just get started with a basic hub of their information. They essentially wanted to provide a way for users to come to for a central area for them to get information about the organization, maybe some updates to their policies, updates to their procedures, a navigation point to other third-party systems that they have within their organization, so that anytime a user went to an application, they would first go to that central hub to then jump off with single sign-on to those other applications, right? I think what's getting valuable for this particular client is they're now starting to pull in workflow from third-party systems as well, and workflow that's automating the process for them to manage some of their business processes themselves. So some of the supply chain functions that they perform are now managed within that central hub. Some of the onboarding and offboarding procedures that they perform from an HR perspective are now managed within that central hub. And the idea is that, having the central hub allows them the opportunity to expand this over time. And some of the benefit, we've talked about SharePoint today, of using a platform like SharePoint is it's very open to allow clients to evolve their system and their infrastructure going forward to incorporate other systems, other workflows, other business processes in the future. But again, as this particular client example demonstrates, you don't have to start that complex. It can start simply as a central repository of information for business line 1 users to consume, to jump off into third-party applications, and as time and interest develops, then you can start to provide more automation within the system itself and pulling data from those other applications into that central hub. I have a couple of other use cases we'll jump into, but before I do so, I'd like to just introduce Carrie Grigg from Crawford, who's sitting with me today, to talk a bit about Crawford's plans and how they utilize SharePoint for internal audit, some of their journey along that path and how they selected to do so, and what they've done subsequent to the initial implementation on their own.
Sure, thank you, James. So one of the things that Crawford & Company was looking to do when we were looking for a new internal audit tool was to give us a way to connect with our different stakeholders throughout the globe in an organization that's been built over time through acquisition and has a lot of disparate systems. So we chose for that reason to go with Office 365 and a SharePoint Online implementation over the top of that. Just speaking from a client's perspective, we wanted something that was easy for people to use and collaborate with immediately, and then have the ability and flexibility over time to expand the functionality and the reach of that portal through enhanced workflows and such. So we actually use the Nintex product, workflows and forms, on top of SharePoint Online to help us with some of that automation. Protiviti was very helpful in providing, I guess, a foundation for a GRC platform, in our case focused on internal audit, and then with some pretty entry-level programming knowledge and just a little bit of drag and drop, we've been able to expand some of those workflows, create some of our own, as well as provide the collaboration tool that people need to work across the globe. We're spread over 71 countries, and certainly it's always a challenge when you've got that kind of a geography spread. So that's long and short of it. I think you can read the slide there and see some of the other things that we've been able to do. Simple rules enforcement, like not allowing someone to be both the preparer and approver, minimum and maximum input values, basic interface controls. All those things are things that we were able to do on our own after the initial tool went in. So just some examples of things that you could do with a platform like SharePoint Online and Nintex.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And again, one of the things that I really enjoy working with clients like Carrie who take an initial implementation and take it further than we both imagined it would be initially. And that's kind of the beauty of, again, using SharePoint, but also looking at, Carrie and Crawford know their business needs far more than a third-party organization. So when they can mold it and evolve it themselves going forward, you'll see some of the examples there at the bottom, but changing some of the way workflow routes for them, automating some of the rules and escalation of activities internally, something that they can do on their own without our involvement is really terrific. And thanks, Carrie, for joining us today.
Sure. I mean, I think what James says is absolutely true. We started out with basic assistance, and then as we were able to learn those simple things, it was able to move up the value chain, and now we're very much using Protiviti as more of a guru kind of role to help us do some pretty complex things, but the simple things we've been able to take over and take on our own.
Thanks, Carrie. So we have a couple of other use case examples here. I'll just touch on that very briefly. We want to leave some time for the last question, a polling question and some Q&A. I think the key here is we just want to highlight how business users or line one involvement or engagement is on these use cases. We've covered internal audit, information request and action plans is a great way to engage that end user community. Vendor risk management, you can utilize SharePoint for this as well in that digital hub, but getting the vendor sponsors within the organization to initiate a process of requesting to onboard a new vendor, manage that risk assessment of that vendor, and then all the way through the actual relationship of that vendor as it goes on through projects that they may work with that account. The next one here is, IT compliance built on the same framework that we've covered already for audit, but, looking at maybe IT standards or ISO, COBIT, and again, even more broadly into other compliance areas such as COSO 2013 framework for some of your Sarbanes-Oxley requirements as well. But again, engaging the business users for information request and action plan resolution. Risk management, again, you'll see the common theme here is getting the business involved for risk assessments, action plans, all through a central hub where they can go into and update their actions across all of these different use cases in one area, but each of the pages themselves that kind of pull up that information are very unique for the different assurance functions. Case management, similar to vendor risk management, but if you have a need to do this in your organization, you can utilize a platform like SharePoint to allow businesses or business line one users to initiate a case, prompt escalation or information request, provide feedback to management as the case goes through its review cycle. Regulatory compliance, looking at your individual regulatory requirements within an organization, be it external regulatory requirements or internal policies, but getting line one involvement to provide input and feedback across those activities and information request details as well as the action plan resolution. And then finally, you'll have that reporting that Scott already pulled up as an example, but all of this kind of comes together, mobile enabled for line one to act and respond to that information as it impacts their particular business segment. We wanted to go through a variety of these use cases at the end just to share with you that you can really use that central hub for a lot of different programs. Pulling it all together gives you the reporting and the meaningful information and layout that you're seeing here. With that, we'd like to go to the last polling question, and then we'll open it up for some of the questions that have been raised during this session.
All right, and the final polling question is, please provide us with feedback regarding the content provided today. All right, thank you very much. And if you would like to provide further feedback, remember that there is an evaluation form attached to the GoToMeeting toolbar.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us today. We wanted to leave 5 minutes for Q&A in terms of questions that have come up during the conversation. I think one of the key themes is James was looping through a lot of those use cases in terms of that line one engagement. I tend to think of it as bookended processes, right? you were noticing that one of the challenges in engaging line one is where do they initiate a process. So when do they need to initiate something? Well, it's when they try to onboard a supplier or when they need to log an incident they've identified, right? So a lot of the GRC systems struggle with initiation, right? On the other end of it, it's where you need their feedback, right? And so now the GRC professional has done a bunch of work, but they need that feedback to say, are you compliant? What's the level of your risk? What's the status of your action plan? So what the hub starts to do is really engage that line one, not just in the traditional assessment, that's the output of risk management, but allowing them to better initiate some of those processes. And lastly, I think as we have alluded to, it's about also commingling the unstructured information with that structured information so that you really start to achieve more true governance, which is actually about more than just risks and controls. It's about the affirmative things you share about your business, the way you acknowledge people, and the way you allow them to execute with efficiency. So with that said, Julia, we'll pause to see if any questions have been coming in through the chat line.
Okay, great. The first question that we have here is, does moving things to the cloud reduce risk or increase risk?
Well, good question. I would, obviously there's opportunities for both. It somewhat depends on your own organizational maturity, right? So I think that moving things to the cloud in general is increasing or changing the risk profile is the way I would say it, right? So, if you're moving from an internal environment that didn't have all of the right internal controls that you needed in terms of especially physical controls, and you're moving it to a cloud provider that's their whole business, right, is making sure that your information is safe. At one level, you're increasing actually your security profile, right? But at a second level, it's just changing it. And I think we've seen organizations that sometimes say, I'm moving to Azure or I'm moving to AWS, and, they have certifications, so I'm fine. And the one thing that I think is an important exposure to think about is that, what those platforms as a service or some of those cloud providers are doing is really very good in terms of the level of control that they provide. But it's a lot around the physical environment, and organizations are still almost wholly responsible for the logical security of their environment. So you need to think about both, and it does actually create a significant exposure if you're just assuming the movement to the cloud is creating a better, more robust risk and control structure for you.
Okay, great. How do you go about getting support given these systems are often very expensive and internal audit budgets are lean?
Well, I think it depends on the approach that internal audit is taking and how much internal audit is engaging with other line 2 professionals. So, in terms of the budget, we do see a lot of times right now from practical experience where organizations are still operating siloed in this, in particular internal audit. And so I think that concepts that start to integrate data are going to be, a little bit less compelling than when the whole organization starts to join up and look at what is our overall risk profile, what's our overall method and approach to governance, right? And so, one thing I would say is their strength in numbers and joining together, but joining together not in a way that says we all have to share the same system. That's actually a key theme, hopefully everyone's taken away today, is that you can join together by overlaying a hub or a workflow and reporting layer. That doesn't necessarily mean you all have to use the same stuff and play in the same playground.
Hey, Scott. This is Kerry Grigg. One of the justifications that we had for our use of the tool and moving to Office 365 and a SharePoint solution was the decreased travel costs. So as an internal audit department, we oftentimes have to travel the world to gather information and collaborate with stakeholders. And one of the things that it allowed us to do was to reduce our travel costs significantly, and we also are able to leverage our offshore resources more efficiently, because with workflows, they can start it and leave it off at a point, and then we can pick it up in the morning and keep going with it during our day. So those were some of the ways that that we got around the cost question. And also, when you talk about the efficiencies of being able to share information across the organization quickly without having to go and gather it each time, there's the uplift in efficiency right there.
Oh, great. Thanks, Carrie. Really appreciate your feedback and input there.
All right, and I think this is the last question. Where do you suggest an organization to begin this process? Are there specific areas, processes that we should consider first?
So the broad answer is that it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all answer. So while we lay out a broad vision for this concept of a digital hub, that doesn't mean you have to eat it all at once. Some of the most significant opportunities we've seen across clients that exist across almost any GRC effort is issue management, because that's a place for clear and simple rationalization of how you track and monitor that information, and a clear place where line one needs to get involved and is typically accessing different systems. So it's a great place to start. The other thing I would say, though, is, as James alluded to, they can run independently of each other, right? Developing a corporate intranet or corporate knowledge management capability that shares information better and creates more collaboration can start to run a little bit independent of the GRC more structured pieces, and at some point then you look for opportunities of where they line up, such as action plan remediation, incident management, where you have people, again, on the front end of that process needing to provide initialized incidents, right? So I think we wouldn't say that there's one perfect place to start. I think issue management's a great opportunity, and I think, again, they don't need to run in a serial or one-by-one method, linear method.
All right, great. I think we are 2 minutes over the time, so that's perfect. Just wanted to let you all know that we will be doing a roundtable series, Improving Governance Through Digital Transformation, in June in Chicago, Dallas, and Atlanta, and Virginia. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can go to protiviti.com/events. And we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We did have a few questions about the slides. We will be sending out the recording link to everyone on the call today, so you will be getting that within 2 business days. Thank you, Scott, James, and Carrie, for presenting today. Lots of great information.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, and everyone have a great day.